with the local development corporation, with defending business rights and tenants' rights throughout the neighborhoods. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then what we're going to go into is having each of our panelists today speak a little bit about their involvement around Columbia's expansion and their work on the issue and how they see Columbia's expansion as affecting the neighborhood of West Harlem. And so first, on my right, we have Norman Siegel. Norman is a former president with the New York Civil Liberties Union. His work has been around tenants' rights, civil rights throughout New York City. As far as First Amendment lawyers go, he has a great perspective on the rights of tenants. And currently, he's defending the business owners in the West Harlem community that wish to remain in the wake of Columbia's plan. Then we have Roland Benini. Roland has been involved for a long time in research, and I'm going to read a quick statement that he has. He's a Latino immigrant and executive director of Parents in Action for Leadership and Human Rights. And Parents in Action is a grassroots organization that aims to protect, preserve, strengthen, and if necessary, reunify families, the cell of human society which are under constant attack by the state and its agents. He is a strong advocate of the natural alliance of Blacks and Latinos in order to raise ourselves in history. So that's Mr. Roland. Next we have Jordi Montrez-Blanc. Jordi is the chair of CB9, the community board. He's been a long-term resident of the West Harlem community and one of the most knowledgeable people about Columbia's plan and also the community's 197A plan to defend and to preserve the character of that neighborhood and create sustainable growth. And then we have Mario Mazzoni. Mario is currently a teacher in the New York public school system. Mario also has been a member for the past 2 years now of the Coalition to Preserve Community, which is a grassroots tenant-based community group that has been fighting for the rights of tenants in the area, mainly through protesting the Columbia administration and the city administration on how they've approached this plan thus far, fighting for the preservation of affordable housing, jobs, and no to the use of eminent domain and biotech research labs. And so I actually would like to begin just by giving a brief overlay of what Columbia's plan is. So when we hear Columbia's expanding into West Harlem, what does that really look like? And one of the pieces of that I think is really important is something that's happening with universities across the country. This idea that every 2 years, universities need to expand by 2.5 million square feet in order to remain competitive with each other, in order to have more research space, more classrooms, more office space for professors, so that they can continue to garner grants and profit from their research. I think this is really important because Columbia, over the past 250 years of its history, has been in a constant process of expanding from the time that it was located down Lower Manhattan until the 1960s and 50s, when it expanded throughout Morningside Heights, displacing tens of thousands of residents, to the 80s and the development of the Uptown medical campus to today and this proposal for West Harlem. The particulars of Columbia's plan is for a campus that has a large footprint from 125th Street to 133rd Street between Broadway and 12th Avenue. That's a 17-acre site. 17 acres is bigger than the footprint of the World Trade Center. So if you can imagine in the site of Manhattan, that's one of the largest developments that has ever happened here. The plan itself is proposed to take the next 30 years to develop. About 5 years of that we're into because of the planning process, but then construction would go on until 2030 at best, and would cost the university upwards $6 billion to build out its plan. Mainly what's included in the plan are research spaces for biotech research labs, neuroscience research labs, advanced technologies, advanced sciences, along with office spaces for administrators, staff employees of the university, and residential spaces and classroom spaces. And the campus itself would also build as high up as, at some points, the grand houses, if you've ever seen the grand houses on 125th and Broadway, and as far below ground as 7 stories, to make space for garages and the power station to actually run this campus. So it's a huge development over the future. I guess the last thing that I would like to say before getting into this is that unfortunately one of our panelists is running a little late and one of our panelists can't be here. They both have really important voices, so of the panelist who is running late, Luisa Hernandez, she's a long-term tenant, will be with us shortly. She is a resident directly in this expansion footprint, along with the other 140 families that would be displaced by Columbia's expansion. Her building is in the Tenant Interim Lease Program, which was mentioned here today, a program to help low-income residents learn how to take care for their housing and then come to own that housing. And so she's been fighting directly to keep her right to remain in her home and come to own her home as that Tenant Interim Lease Program is staked out. The other person who unfortunately can't join us because of a family emergency is Marlene Petty. Marlene is a resident of 3333 Broadway. 3333 Broadway is the large former Mitchell-Lama complex of 1,200 units on the other side of 133rd Street, across the street from Columbia's plan. Already, this is the building that Nellie mentioned before. Already this building has seen 200 to 300 of its residents have to leave their homes because of increases in the rents. And so I'll try to bring those perspectives in as much as I can, and I'm sure our panelists can also add to those things in talking about their own work. And myself, just so you do know who I am, I'm a student at Columbia University, and I'm a part of a student group called the Student Coalition on Expansion and Gentrification that see ourselves as a force in between what the Columbia administration wants to do to the West Harlem community, and trying to organize the student body and raise consciousness around that. And so to get started, I'm wondering if actually we should start. I'm wondering if you could start, Norm, and just give us an overview of the issues of eminent domain around this plan, and if there's anything that connects for you, Columbia's history as a developer in this plan.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. The title of the conference is the first annual Harlem Anti-Gentrification Conference. The historic community of Harlem under attack. So true. Fight back and resistance. Forging alliances and building principal unity. The issue of the Columbia expansion plan is smack in the middle of the title of this conference. And most of you, I would imagine, are here because you're concerned about what's going on not only in New York City, but in cities all across America, where upscale development, luxury housing is driving not just low-income people, but people who've lived in communities for a long time. And a lot of it's being driven by developers, and that's being driven by financial considerations. And then regular folk get squeezed out and pushed out. I'm here to tell you that we can fight back, that we don't have to allow that to happen the way it is happening. And for people who say you can't fight back and you can't win, I say they're wrong. And we can prove that on this project. One of the great things about this effort so far, which is 3 years in the making, is that it's brought people across racial lines together and brought people along economic lines together. You just look around this room and you see African American, Latino, and Caucasian folk. You see people who are young, and then there's some of us like me who are not so young anymore. I just look young. But I've been doing this for many, many years. We have an opportunity in New York City, in West Harlem, to send out not only a clear message, but to create a model for how lawyers, professionals, working people, seniors can come together and fight back the gentrification and the overdevelopment that's occurring and occurring in New York City as well. If we win here, we will create hope for people throughout the city who don't have the history that this community has, that don't have guys like Jordy on the community board, people who don't have a Nellie or a CPC, or students at Columbia who are prepared to play a very important role. We already have the coalition that people dream about. The challenge for us is to stay together. Not let them divide us. Not let them divide us along racial lines, economic lines, or whatever lines. I tell you today, if we stay together, we will win. And what does winning mean? Winning means changing the dynamic so that the developers and the politicians have to deal realistically with the community input and the community's positions with regard to development. It can be done. It can be done because first, as I tell you, the law is on our side. And second, it can be done because we will effectively learn how to work the media so that our story is told even though we don't have the resources that the other side has. Standing in a church, I think of David versus Goliath. We are David. Columbia is Goliath. But we know in that biblical story who won. David won. We can win too. This project and your role is to be outspoken. When there are hearings, you got to come. And you got to bring neighbors and friends who speak out. If you've never done it before, get in touch with us. We'll do trainings. Many of us, at one point in our lives, never got up before a group and spoke. It's like shooting a foul shot, although some people like Shaq can't do it. The more you do it, the better you get at it. So if you've never given a speech before or spoke at a hearing, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And your words, your voice, has to be in this fight. Because if your voice is not in the fight, we lose. So don't think your voice doesn't count. It is essential. Learning the issues. You've got people in this conference and people in the community who are experts on the issues who will only too willingly work with you. I've been asked to talk about the issue of eminent domain. Columbia has refused to take the issue of eminent domain off the table. What is eminent domain? Eminent domain says that the government can take someone's private property, your home, your business, if it's for public use. And when they take it, they have to give fair compensation, just compensation. When this country was set up, respect for property rights was greater than it is today. And for almost 200 years, the only time the government could take someone's property is when it was for a public highway, the public roads. That's how they built the infrastructure of America and that's appropriate. If you're building a public school, a public library, you can condemn someone's property, rip it down, pay them for what it's worth, and then build the public building that's open to the public. Very key. About 50 years ago, the Supreme Court in Washington said, we're going to allow the government to take it from a private person and give it to a private developer if it's for a public purpose. It was the beginning of what they called slum clearance. It was the beginning of the concept that if a neighborhood is blighted, slum clearance, let's rip the buildings down and build it. In the case of 1954 out of Washington, D.C., it was basically talking about the buildings that were there in the poor neighborhoods that were wooden shacks that were horrible for people to live in. So it made sense for the government to play a role in helping people with housing. Then they brought in it again. So now it's not just public use, then it became public purpose, then it became public benefit. And in the documents that have been circulated recently through our lawsuit to get the documents, Columbia's people are actually using the word public interest. So we've gone from public use to purpose to benefit to interest. Now, legally, what they're doing is they're making the concept broader, making it easier. What is the public interest? Whose interest? Who's to define who's the public? You're the public. You're the public as much as Columbia, if not more. That's why I say you have an essential role in this. So in the context of the issue, for many years, until just recently, corporations, developers, were using eminent domain. There was a close relationship between the contributions that came from the developers and the corporations to who? To the politicians. And then the politicians would respond by making it easier for the developers to develop. General Motors in Michigan in 1980 wanted to expand its plant. So it wanted to take over 3 blocks in a neighborhood. So they got eminent domain. And they promised that their business would provide jobs, sound familiar? Would provide increased taxes to the city of Detroit. And given that economic development, the court said it's a public benefit, jobs and increased income. But it was interesting, 24 years later, 2 summers ago, the same case came back to the court in Michigan. And they looked, almost 24 years later, to see, were there more jobs? Was there more income to the city? And in a very rare situation, the Supreme Court of Michigan reversed its decision from back in 1980 and said, we're going to make it a little more difficult to get eminent domain because the promises by the developers, in this case General Motors, turned out to be, the word was illusory. It wasn't real. And in the last few years, out in California, in Illinois, courts have been beginning to look more carefully at the promises of the developers under the premise of eminent domain. A year ago, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case out of New London, Connecticut, by 5-4, it's 9 justices on the court. It was interesting. The liberals voted for eminent domain. The conservatives, including Clarence Thomas, voted against it. Very strange alignment. So just because you think someone politically is liberal, don't think they're going to be good on the eminent domain issue. And just because you don't like some of the conservatives, they might be really good on the property right issue. So this allows for a strange alliance, for a coalition, ideologically, that is kind of weird. But it can happen, and it's beginning to happen. In that case, and very important because that will set the guidelines for whether Columbia's plan, if they use eminent domain, is going to be approved constitutionally. And the important thing in that case is the court said that the process was a fair process. The city council there held hearings. People came. What do you want to do about the land in New London? And people came and they gave their thoughts. And then they made up the plan without who the developer was. They made it up the way the community wanted it to be. Then they put out requests for proposals. 6 developers put in. They chose one. And then they allowed that person to develop the land. And that was key because Justice Kennedy was the 5th vote. And he said that if the process wasn't done openly and fairly, he would not have voted for it. We come to the Columbia plan. Did the city council hold a hearing to say, what do we want to do with that land from a 125 to 134? From Broadway to 12th? Hell no. Who moved this plan? Columbia moved the plan. Columbia contacted the state. Columbia contacted the city. It's Columbia who's pushing the plan. And the plan is for a private university. You remember what I said before? What's the key word in eminent domain? Columbia is not a public university. City College is a public university. I've said over and over again, if City College was doing this, we could be in trouble. But your children, my grandchildren, they don't have a right to go to Columbia. Columbia, being a private institution, can choose whether my granddaughters will be able to go there. So it's not public.
And then $60,000 to pay a year.
In addition to that. But the key point is, it's not a public university. So given that, we feel that Columbia can't use eminent domain. There are a handful of businesses. I'm happy to be their lawyer. They are refusing to leave. Many businesses were approached and they sold. I'm not touching that issue. I believe people have a right to choose what they want to do. But the ones that want to stay, Tuckerway, Hudson, the moving places on Broadway from 130th to 132nd, they want to stay. They've been here for a long time. It's not about money for them. They want to be here. From 132 to 133, there are people who live there. They don't want to leave either. I believe we in the community need to support them, to give them moral, spiritual, and, in my case, legal support so that they can stay and they don't have to leave. The premise that Columbia wants it all, that they must have every parcel of land from 125 to 134 from Broadway to 12th, I reject it. And hopefully you will reject it. This community board, you know, community boards in New York City are weird too. I've never seen community boards unanimous on anything. It's the nature of New Yorkers. New Yorkers will argue over everything. Even if they don't know anything, they're experts on it. But that's why I love New York. The town of the big mouths. Now, Jordy is a leader. Jordy got that community board to vote 29-0 against the use of eminent domain. I won't give his famous quote that he made that night, because I don't want to take that line from him.
You can do it.
But this is someone I respect, and he basically said, when he just said, over his dead body will eminent domain occur. When you have leaders like that committed to principle, we got to support them. Even if we disagree sometimes on something, we've got to stay together on this one, especially on eminent domain, meaning no displacement, no eminent domain. It's a principled position. It's not negotiable. It's got to be taken off the table before there can be any serious discussions about any kind of compromises on this. And going back, they can build, meaning Columbia, its expansion, University, Columbia North, whatever they want to call it, and they don't need everything. In fact, the community board spent 10 years in developing their plan for that area. And they include Columbia in their plan. But not 100% of that land goes to Columbia. You know, when you grow up with your kids and your grandkids, you say to them, you don't get everything in life. You got to share. I had two of my granddaughters, Bridget and Emma. Emma's 7, Bridget's 4. Bridget had the ice cream. She wouldn't share before I came here with Emma. And I had to sit down in the kitchen table and explain to Bridget what sharing is about. It's the same conversation that has to occur with Columbia. You got to share. There's enough here for everybody. You can't have it all. And if they try to do eminent domain, I will go to court. We will represent the people who in the businesses want to stay, and we need your support, because lawyers by themselves, as I learned in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia in the 60s in the Southern Civil Rights Movement, I say Southern because we ain't had our civil rights movement up south in New York yet. So those are issues here too. You can't ignore the racial overtones that are here. You can't ignore the class overtones that are involved in these issues. That's why this fight, because so far no one has been able to divide us along the racial lines. Look, I know as much as you all know, and you probably know more than me, the reason why there should be some divide along the racial lines. But we got to hang together on this one so that we can win on this one, and privately we'll deal with all the problems that we have among ourselves. But when we go out there to fight Columbia, we need to be together. Black, brown, red, yellow, and white together, we can overcome. Finally, there's going to be a certification process where in the city there's a ULURP process. I'll let Jordy explain it. It's going to take 7 months where Columbia is asking to rezone the area. The public review is crucial. And again, you're the public. The students from Columbia are going to work this summer analyzing the documents that we get on June 18th. There will probably be a hearing sometime in July run by the community board. I've got good memory. I'm looking carefully at every face in this room. And if you ain't there at that hearing, I'm coming to get you. So you need to be there. And again, if you're a little nervous about talking, come talk to me. We'll do some prep work together. But I want all of you to not only be there, I want you to get up and speak in your own voices from your heart about why this is important and why you should stay and Columbia can't throw people out. And if we do that, we will win. And winning means that Columbia doesn't get everything. The people that want to stay can stay. And maybe there can be some benefits for the community at large where the leaders will negotiate that. But again, the last point I want to leave you with is that what happens here can have a ripple effect throughout the city of New York. There are lots of communities throughout this city who are facing the same fight. And they don't have the history that Harlem has. They don't have the leaders that West Harlem has. And they don't have what's in this room. So if we can win here with the business community working with the civil rights community and with all of us coming together, it sets the example for other communities how they can fight back the overdevelopment and the gentrification that's happening in their communities. So this is, I think, a historical challenge. I'm confident we're all up for the challenge, and if some of you think you're not, let's talk after the formal presentations and we'll build up your confidence so that you too, together, black, brown, red, yellow, and white together, we will overcome. Thank you.
So, Shorty, if you could speak next about some of the more bigger
Norman mentioned that the community board had spent 10 years. Well, actually, it was close to 20 years in developing our vision of how we would like to see our district develop. Our district is 964 acres. The West Manhattanville target area of Columbia is 17 acres. The area that Columbia wants rezoned is 35 acres. The Columbia plan, 30-year plan, is for the 17 acres. I call the 35 acres rezoning their 50-year plan. The plan was developed in an open, participatory way. The community, members of the board, working together for many years. Inclusive Columbia. Inclusive Columbia. So we completed our plan, or we were almost completing our plan when the new administration in Columbia comes out with their own development plan for the 17 acres of West Manhattanville. And it wasn't anything like what we have been talking for 20 years. Their plan is called a 197C. 197A is the community board's plan for the whole district. Columbia's plan is called 197C. And those numbers refer to sections of the city charter under which community boards and developers are allowed to create these plans and ask for rezoning. Okay? The plan that the community board presented is one that allows Columbia to expand. It will not result in displacement. It will not result in the disruption of the neighborhood that their plan brings up. The Columbia plan basically calls for they taking over these 17 acres, and it's all or nothing. They want to dig down 70 feet, that's 7-story, and they want to build buildings 20, 25-story high. So we're talking about a massive disruption. Not only do they want to go 10-story below ground, they want to create what everybody is calling a bathtub. That is all underground to communicate and be accessible to each other under the streets. The project is a project that is going to require resetting of the aqueduct, the water pipes, resetting of the sewer lines, resetting of the electric wiring, resetting of the gas lines, resetting of the electric wires that are underneath. And every time that's done, who is going to suffer the consequences of that is the neighborhood, because if they have to break the street to reset them, it's going to be a period of time where there is no water, where there is no sewer, where there is no electricity, where there are no telephones, where there is no gas. Who will suffer for that? The residents of the area. As far south as Morningside Heights, as far as north as Hamilton Heights, as far as west as maybe Central Harlem. Because this is such a long-term plan of 30 years, roughly broken into 3 10-year stages, it means that for 30 years we're going to be suffering the demolition of buildings, the trucks in and out, the noise, because more than likely they're going to have to blast sometime if they're going to go down 7-story. The only way that you can break to the rock in New York is to blast it. All of this creates what? Dust. And also, it will start displacing our most unwanted neighbors. Rats, mice, and all the other undesirable critters that are all over the place, like we all know. Who is going to suffer the consequences of that? The residents of Morningside, Manhattanville, Hamilton Heights. Heck, they may even get away to Central Harlem because those critters tend to travel at night. We are coming now to the certification. We had a press conference yesterday, which I called. We had fairly good coverage. You know, when a community board chairman called for a meeting, for a press conference, not too many people show up. We had New York One. We had the Daily News. We had the Sun. We had the Spanish paper. A couple of other publications. So there's been some ink spent on us. But the fact is that we have made a point. The point is we had over 50 people in there yesterday making our voices heard. I did not expect anything to come out of that except the satisfaction of telling them off. About an hour and a half after the meeting, after the press conference, I had received a phone call that they had rescheduled the certification from the 4th to the 18th. So they're giving us a couple of weeks. And they called me to tell me that like if it was a big thing that they were doing for us. And I told them, I'd take the 2 weeks. Do not expect me to be thankful. Do not expect me to be gracious or kind to Department of City Planning, to Columbia University, or to the administration. The mayor's office basically has said, we don't want nothing to do with anything in this. We don't want to intervene. We don't want to be a part of it. Well, non-intervention means non-intervention on anybody's side, and we're going to be keeping a very close eye on that to make sure that is thus. Norman mentioned our unity and all the strange bedfellows in the West Side. I mean, stranger than a Jewish liberal lawyer from New York and a extreme right-wing conservative like myself to be on the same side fighting the same fight together tells you how important this is.
I didn't know that's what you were.
Actually, I am a fascist. By some people's standards. Yeah. The fact is that West Harlem is a very diverse community. It is diverse racially. It is diverse ethnically. It is diverse culturally. It is diverse linguistically. It is diverse in diversity. Because even, for example, you have a large Spanish-speaking community, there are 25 different cultures represented in that. And every one of them is totally independent of the other and not the same. Although somebody invented the Hispanic Latino classification, the fact is that there are 25 countries where people come from who speak Spanish. It's like if we throw everybody who speaks English and say they're all Englishmen. Yeah? What are we going to do about it? What we're doing is we are putting in the fight. We are not throwing in the towel. The only time that somebody is defeated is when they don't get up. When somebody don't get up, they are defeated. And I tell you, I have an iron jaw, and when I fought, I've been knocked down many times, but there wasn't one time that I stayed down. I have never been knocked down, and it's not going to happen with Columbia. Now, eminent domain. Community Board 9 is adamantly against eminent domain for private purposes. We have expressed this many occasions. We are particularly offended at the idea of taking this housing from people who have been struggling for years and that now have the opportunity to become owners or to at least live in some of them are not going to be cooperatives, some of them are going to be not-for-profit rentals, but that means that they will be affordable to people of low income for forever. Not for 5 years or 10 years or 25 years, forever. We will not allow that to happen. And when I said over my dead body, I meant it. And anybody who knows me knows that I don't use those words lightly. Those are fighting words. I'm a former U.S. Marine. I have fought many times, many places, and this is only a small skirmish that we are going to be facing. We're looking to get your support. I don't think any of you live in West Side. Anybody here from the West Side? You all from Central Harlem? East Harlem? Brooklyn. Well, you don't fight in Brooklyn. You got the Atlantic Yards. Right? And you're doing a good fight on that, right? So we're looking anyway for your support. We are looking to continue this fight for a long time. And we are not down. And like Norman said, we are David. So we're going to make sure we got slings and that our stones are big enough to knock down Goliath. Thank you.
So, Mario, if you could speak about the Coalition Reserve Community and then also the local development corporation and housing.
Okay, my name is Mario Mazzoni. I'm a member of a group called the Coalition to Preserve Community. That's a group that started before I was not one of the founding members. It was a group that was started among existing activists, tenants, various people from a lot of constituencies in the neighborhood when they were first made aware of Columbia's intentions. That group is a very, very broad group now. And there's some reasons why. If you look at most neighborhood groups, they're single issues. Columbia's plan would be so dramatic in its impact on the neighborhood that, as has been mentioned, you have business owners, property owners, rent-stabilized tenants, public housing tenants, environmental activists. All of these people are absolutely outraged at what would happen if Columbia's plan were to happen. So that's why we have such a broad base of support. Get your pens out. I'm going to tell you how to find out more information. The website that we have is stopcolumbia.org. Very easy. On that site, you can actually sign up to receive emails if you get this. If you have grandkids or children that know what I'm talking about, write it down and they'll do it for you. We will have your information and we'll be able to let you know about upcoming meetings and events in the neighborhood. So I wanted to elaborate first on why is this project so influential in terms of it. So we've covered the residential tenants living in their places. We see what's going on in terms of displacement. You can't miss it. Sometimes you can't put a finger on it, right? You don't know who to blame. You don't know who to account for, but you can't miss it. You see the neighborhood, every neighborhood in New York City, every neighborhood. We all think if you live in Brooklyn, you think it's happening to Brooklyn. If you live in the Bronx, you think it's happening in the Bronx. You don't realize it's happening everywhere where people who have contributed, loved their community, are losing a grasp on it. And the impact of that is enormous. I think this is a point that's a little bit lost on people of the people we're fighting against because they don't quite get what that means. I have one thing I started to notice is that if you're when you go into downtown Lower Manhattan, there's not the sense of a neighborhood in some of these areas that have finished kind of a process of gentrification that you get uptown. People don't know their neighbors. Their friends are people that they know from their jobs. Their friends are people that they know from their social clubs, the universities they went to. When you go uptown, there's a sense, as we all know, you know your neighbor, you know everyone at the corner store. If you need somebody to let you in to their apartment, you can hand them your keys and they'll let you in, right? They'll let your friend in. They'll store bags. You have somebody who's going to take care of your kids if you have to go to the hospital, right? These are the kind of social networks that are built that we see eroding around us that I don't think it even makes sense to some people who say, well, why shouldn't Columbia get in? Look at this neighborhood. Look, I don't see anything of value here. Of course, it would be better if a multi-billion-dollar plan were instituted by an Ivy League university. Why shouldn't you be happy that they want to come into your neighborhood? So we see this going on around us, and that's why some of us got involved. The plan involves displacing over 450 tenants directly, people who are going to be homeowners or who are renters right now would be moved out of their homes by force. They don't want to leave. They're not being priced out. Columbia says, we want it, we want you out, and the plan involves taking them out. There's businesses that have been around for decades that don't want to leave. Columbia's plan says, you must go. I'm not asking you if you want to go. You must go. And that's how the plan was presented. The area goes, as they said, from 125th to 134th. Both sides of Broadway go on part of that plan. And the plan would completely dominate the neighborhood. It would be like a miniature skyscraper district in Upper Manhattan. As you can imagine, the impact of that would be huge, and it would not just be on those blocks. So the majority of people that have come to fight, they don't live necessarily in that zone or work. They're not one of the 1,000 workers that has a job necessarily in that zone. Those people are absolutely in the fight. A lot of the people live 2 blocks away, 5 blocks away, 10 blocks away. St. Nicholas Avenue, 145th Street, wherever it is that you know that when this comes in, it will drive you out. Anyway, that's one of the reasons why people are involved. I did want to speak briefly about the history of Columbia University. We know that for every luxury development that comes in, all of the neighborhood around it gets threatened. But Columbia has a special relationship to its neighbors that I don't think you could describe as anything other than antagonistic. They don't like their neighbors. When Columbia moved into Morningside Heights, for the campus that we know now of as Columbia's campus, that area was being developed as an upper middle class enclave away from the city. You know, every rich development is one step ahead of the edge of the city. That's how New York was built. In the 50s and 60s, the demographics of the whole city of New York were changing. You'd had a massive migration of African Americans from the South. You had a huge migration of Puerto Ricans coming into New York City. And you had the beginnings of the post-war middle-class white flight to suburban areas. During this time, Columbia, this is all public information, Columbia sent around memos saying, we cannot let our neighborhood become part of the rest of Harlem. We don't want this to happen. So they started, the first thing they did was get involved on the local government. They got the city to start carving out areas for themselves. So they first went out and carved out, lobbied to get the area that's now Morningside Gardens and Grant Houses to be developed for them. They said, we want this as a buffer between Harlem and Columbia University. Public housing ended up turning out a little differently than they first thought it would. For a moment, public housing was thought of as a way of keeping the poor slum area out of the neighborhood, and then over time it became considered something that you didn't want in a middle-class area. So they then, after that point, made the city promise not to put any public housing between 110th and 125th after Grant Houses had been built. They went around to the private buildings that had low-income tenants in them, and they either bought them for conversion or convinced the city to have them emptied out for the sole purpose of getting the people who live there out. not because they wanted to expand, but because they wanted to change the demographics of the area. If you look at the map of what Columbia University's campus is now in Morningside Heights, that area with the gates, that's about half of what they have. Because all the residential buildings around there, one by one, they've acquired. Until now, I think, what is it, 10% or less of how much of the Morningside Heights is not owned by an institution?
Probably about 10 to 12%.
10 to 12%. So you walk around in the buildings, and it is an enclave just for themselves. If you live near to an area like that, you need to know that you're threatened if you don't fit within that particular, confine of what Columbia sees as their own vision. So one of the reasons I got involved, I've lived in New York City for 10 years. I came when I was 18 years old. If this will tell you where I fall into the scale, I've moved 27 times. Because I messed up my credit, didn't have a lot of money, had to rely on, up until now where I can't afford anything now that I have, a career as a teacher. I can't afford to live in the places that I've set roots. The only thing really, I think, keeping most of the neighborhoods that we know how they are is rent stabilization, and that's, I can promise you, disappearing as somebody who's still on the housing market. 1 out of every 500 apartments is being rented as a rent stabilized apartment. Once it hits $2,000 rent, it's gone. There's no more regulations for these housing. So there's no neighborhood I loved more than Hamilton Heights when I moved in there about 4 years ago, and I wanted to make sure that community stayed what it was for the people who were there and for myself, that I loved that area. So that's why I got involved. The last comment I want to make is this 30-year plan for the development of Harlem. My feeling is that they don't want to move in right now. Columbia doesn't want to be a part of Harlem now. They want to be a part of Harlem 15 years down the road if the trajectory stays the same. They have shown no interest in sharing with the community. Why are they asking for all or nothing? We don't want a campus that's integrated with the community. Could it possibly be that Columbia does not want to come into the Harlem of today? It wants to reshape a neighborhood around it in its own image and then move into that? That's my personal feeling. They are attracting people from the upper income categories of around the country, saying that we have a community for you. Harlem doesn't fit that image. And I think they're easily able to tell other people influential in city administration, Harlem is in need of change. People who live here love the neighborhood as it is. When the stores change, the housing changes, the residents around you change, it isn't always for the better. A lot of people feel alienated in the community once there's been an upheaval. So that's why a lot of us are involved. So again, Coalition to Preserve Community invites you to participate. Go to our website, stopcolumbia.org. Sign up to be a member. I know we've all been speaking quite long in our discussions about it. So, Brian, you said there was something about a local development corporation? Yeah, I guess all I'm going to say, there's a group was, I'm not a participant on that, but a group was formed, Local Development Corporation, to create a community benefits package for the community. The Coalition to Preserve Communities' position on this is that the project itself is unacceptable. I don't know what benefit at the moment they could offer that would then therefore make eminent domain okay. Take some of the outrageous things off the table, and we might be willing to consider the benefits that Columbia could offer to us. But at this point, if Columbia is telling us, we want everything from you, why do we need to have a handout, you know? That discussion can go later. There was one other thing that wasn't brought up. The biotech facilities in this is one thing that's drawn people who may not have otherwise joined in. The biotech facilities want a biosafety level 3 rating, which is the second highest you can possibly get. The only higher level is a biosafety 4, which is for diseases that there's no known cure for. So biosafety level 3 means that Columbia, and this is about 40% of their development, Columbia would be permitted to study SARS, avian flu, the bubonic plague, Do you remember that from history books? Killed half of the world's population. Smallpox. All of these extremely deadly substances, anthrax, that we're hearing about that really don't belong in any urban community. So all of these things would be next door to all of us. That's a threat to all of us. We're saying we don't want this in somebody else's neighborhood. We don't want this in our urban community. This does not belong in a high-density area. So this is really a safety issue, a quality of life issue, and an issue about the type of neighborhood that we want to live in, we want to stay in, and we want our neighbors to stay in. Thank you.
So we're going to have Roland speak about Columbia's role as a researcher in the community. Columbia has a number of projects dedicated to the community. This is an example of where that research is not one that benefits its relationship with the community or West Harlem or Harlem.
Yeah, my name is Rolando Bini. I'm a Latino immigrant. I think that we need to take Colombia at its word. They say that they want either all or nothing. I think that the answer is already there. It's nothing. I mean, if they are going to present it like that, they are unwelcome. And I want to go over a little about the history of Colombia as being very unfriendly to humans, to say the least. They were the leaders on studies on eugenics that were copied by the Nazis, and many of the Nazi scientists and doctors and psychiatrists, they came here to Colombia in the 30s to learn from Columbia University, and they went back to Germany and applied those, whatever information they got from here from Colombia. And it was really telling when Germany lost the war, 1945, and those scientists were brought to trial in Nuremberg. One of the main defenses was that while they were being put to trial, all they were doing is applying what they had learned here at Columbia. Also, Columbia was a leader in experiments on radiation. After the invention of the atomic bombs, they did a lot. They participated in a lot of experiments on human radiation done by the Department of Energy. Also, they were key part of the Manhattan Project. That's why they said the name is called Manhattan Project, on the development on the 2 atomic bombs that were used, by the way, on civilian populations, not on military targets. They were also leaders on 2 new type of experiments. One is the clinical trials with foster care children that went on for 13 years here at the Incarnation Children's Center in Washington Heights under the leadership of Columbia University. And that was done with children who were taken from their mothers under the excuse that the mothers, when they went to public hospitals to deliver or for medical examinations, the mothers had tested HIV positive. But it's very telling that of all those children who were taken away from their mothers, only they were black and Latino children. There was not even one white child, and that is impossible that in a population of 8 million people in New York, there was not even one woman who happens to be white who tested HIV positive. Now, without the consent of the parents, these children were used for clinical trials with extremely toxic drugs. Many of them died. And they were experiments that had nothing to do of any possible benefit to the child. Some of those clinical trials had to do with what they call wasting syndrome, is to see how fast a person who is given these toxic drugs die. And basically, the drugs, the experiments with drugs, they start with very high levels of toxicity, and if the child doesn't die, they lower it to see what is the label they can establish. One of the drugs that was used was the famous AZT, which is a drug that has been used 40 years before for cancer therapies, but was taken out